back to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast on the big and interesting stories in the region. My name is Amber Zaman, and today we'll be talking about Turkey's African ambitions. Turkey's diplomatic and military ascendancy in the Horn of Africa is spooking its regional rivals, notably Israel and the United Arab Emirates. All are jockeying for influence in these critical shipping lanes whose value has shot up since the Iran war. Nowhere is Turkey's clout more evident than in Somalia, where Turkey has built its largest overseas base. The primary justification for the Turkish presence is to arm and train Somali forces who are fighting the terrorist group Al-Shabaab. But its military presence is seen as more of a strategic foothold in the much-coveted Red Sea. In 2024, Ankara signed an oil exploration and production deal with Mogadishu that is drawing sharp criticism from the Somali opposition, because it's largely on Turkey's terms. With us here to discuss Turkey's controversial African forays is Dr. Gonul, the director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program. So welcome to our program, Gonul.
Thanks for having me, Amber.
We're very lucky to have you here today because we know that you've just freshly returned from Eastern Africa, and that's what we're going to talk about today, about Turkey and its Horn of Africa ambitions, but focusing mainly on Somalia, where it's extremely heavily invested and in fact has its largest overseas base, among other things. Why is Turkey so interested in Somalia, Gonul?
Well, actually, Turkey's involvement in Somalia has become almost a model for the rest of its engagement across Africa. It goes back to the roots of that relationship, goes back to 2011. And that was when President Erdogan, he paid a visit with his family, and the country was suffering from a really horrible environmental catastrophe. And I remember at the time Erdogan wrote this piece for Foreign Affairs called Tears of Somalia. And I'm telling you this because it's so important, and it just gives you an idea about Turkey's playbook, Africa playbook. So Somalia, in a sense, has become a model where Turkey injects itself into these countries using humanitarian diplomacy. So it employs several strategies, one of which is using both state and also non-state, non-governmental organizations, for example, that are linked to the government, humanitarian organizations. So that builds goodwill at the local level. And that's the next step, which is institutional engagement. So you see several Turkish bureaucratic institutions like TİKA and others going in there and engaging in infrastructure projects that further expands Turkey's influence. And then I think the final stage is where Turkey cultivates these very close defense ties. So Somalia is, in a sense, the peak of that kind of engagement, and Erdogan is trying to replicate that elsewhere, not successfully, I would say, but Somalia presents a very important vision, which is Africa. I mean, this is not Turkey's first engagement with Africa. There were previous efforts. In 2005, Erdogan defined the year as the Africa year, and before that, in the 1990s, Ismail Cem, Turkey's foreign minister at the time, he had this vision of engaging Africa more, but it never really happened until, I would say, 2011, and there are reasons for that. So I would like to note this. When people ask me what is driving Turkey's Africa policy, here's my answer. Obviously, there are several things that Turkey is pursuing, and that includes trade, it includes infrastructure cooperation, energy cooperation, but there is just one driver, I think, that is more important than others, and that is the defense sector. And we can go into details of that. But so if you look at Somalia, Somalia just captures everything that Erdogan wants to do across the region.
Yeah, so we need to look at the map for that, don't we, Gonul? And especially in light of what's going on now in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, location, location, location, as I keep saying. And Somalia has a particularly lucrative location. So let's talk about that a bit and why that is what is really whetting Turkey's appetite.
Great question, Amberin, and that was one of the things that we had discussed when I was in Kenya attending this workshop. We talked about how the current war in Iran is boosting the region's strategic importance for several actors. Turkey is certainly not the only actor operating in the Horn of Africa. It's becoming a crowded space, actually. You have the Emiratis, you have Saudi, you have Qataris, and now Israel. What the war is doing is obviously what happened to the Strait of Hormuz. Countries are realizing how vulnerable they are and how important it is to have a say or to have some kind of influence over these critical straits. So Somalia emerges, and the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea in general emerges as this very strategic choke point, a region where countries want to insert their influence. And Erdogan is very proud. And he recently said, when we talked about our African strategy, when we cultivated this relationship with Somalia, people asked us, why is this relevant? What are we doing there? See how that was a really wise decision. And he's right. Israelis are now particularly interested in the region. We've been hearing reports that the Emiratis are building a base in Somaliland, and that really unnerves Turkish officials because the reports are saying that Emiratis are doing this on behalf of Israel. So all this is to say the current war only boosted the importance of this region for several reasons. Again, you just want to have an alternative to the Strait of Hormuz. But countries like Saudi Arabia, for instance, because things are Iran now controls the Strait of Hormuz. Saudis are using their Red Sea ports, and that's very important for Israel as well. And there's also the Iran factor. If you look at it from Israel's point of view, historically, Israelis have been worried about Iranian influence in the Horn of Africa, in places like Sudan, for instance. So this is their way of responding to the current moment by expanding their influence in the region. And that will only mean that space is going to get even more crowded, and the geopolitical competition among these powers is only going to get tense, more tense.
But at the same time, of course, this is creating quite a bit of debate, let's say, inside Somalia itself, for example, where the opposition has accused the government, that is obviously very overtly backed by Turkey, of kind of selling out the country. They refer in particular to the recent oil deal that was signed between Turkey and Somalia, and that will allow Turkey to start drilling for oil offshore. And in fact, indeed, I think the drill ships have already arrived there. And the terms of that deal are apparently entirely in favor of Turkey. So, and at this time, there is also a political crisis inside Somalia where the mandate of the current president, Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, is set to expire. And we saw something quite extraordinary occur over the past weekend when Turkish F-16s flew over the capital as demonstrators took to the streets. And this was seen as overt interference in the country's domestic affairs. Can you comment a bit on this too? Because at the end of the day, all this, emphasis on hard power, on geopolitics, on, grabbing, the most important part of the coastline, this sort of thing. What about the humanitarian dimension, you know, democracy, that sort of thing? Soft
Yeah,
power that Turkey used to be so good at.
I'm really glad you brought this up, Mirin, because we don't discuss this enough. And the narrative, particularly Erdogan's narrative, is that Turkey is there in Africa as a partner, not as a patron, and it frames its involvement in Africa as a win-win strategy where Turkey, according to the narrative, is helping these countries build their institutions, provide safety, security. So there's all this narrative that is that's pronounced particularly in Muslim majority places where Erdogan frames this as part of a Muslim solidarity network. And again, the narrative is that, we go in there and people love us. People love the fact that Turkey is so involved and people are on board with this. Local communities are on board with this. But there is a story that is not being told, and that is that I've seen firsthand. In the workshop that I attended, I met with people from those places, Somalians who were working in that democratic space. Some of them were democracy and human rights activists and other former government officials. So with all kinds of backgrounds, and they were very critical of Turkey's presence in their country, in Somalia. And one of the reasons that they raised is that because this relationship between Erdogan and Hassan Sheikh, the Somalian president, is so opaque. There are just so many things that we don't know. Just recently, for example, Turkey decided to give away $30 million, and we don't know what that is about. And the Somalian president, by the way, according to UN reports, is and Transparency International reports, he's one of the most corrupt leaders in Africa. So the local view from some of these democracy activists is that our democracy is already struggling. We're a poor country. We don't have security. We have all these problems. There are border conflicts. So this is a very problematic region. And then all these foreign actors like Turkey, Emiratis, and others, when they interfere with domestic affairs, it has several horrible impacts. One of them is they're propping up these regional autocrats. So that means it's shrinking the democratic space further, and that's really very making life very difficult for us. And second, they raise the issue of sovereignty. They say, for example, in Somalia, I mean, Turkey is so embedded, so entrenched in Somalian politics that even at an operational level, they make decisions. For example, just recently, one of the chief military officers in Somalia was removed, and his replacement was someone who was very close to Ankara. And when you control ports, for example, when you control as a foreign actor these key infrastructure, it raises all kinds of questions. And the third is these relationships that are not really institutionalized or that's not open to public scrutiny, it also feeds these local corruption networks. That's bad news for that democratic space that I just mentioned. So that's why I think there's this sense and there's this increasing pushback from local communities about what these countries foreign actors are doing in their countries. And I would like to also add this. It's again, there are beyond Turkey, there are other countries that are involved, and the main question becomes, what does their involvement mean for democracy, for human rights, for continuation of these local conflicts? And the answer is not encouraging because chaos works in these countries' favors. So these countries are often able to expand their influence most effectively where there is state collapse, where there's civil war, or deep institutional weakness,
We
right?
saw
So
that in Libya, for example, where Turkey
that's
stepped
exactly
in
right.
and then
Yes,
signed that massive energy agreement, or rather the water agreement with Libya, with Tripoli.
it, that's exactly right. And
The
then there's
maritime treaty, sorry. It's finally come out, maritime
so when
treaty.
when there is all this chaos, chaos creates openings for these foreign actors. And again, I mean, Ankara is one of the most prominent external actors in the Horn of Africa, with a footprint that stretches from infrastructure and defense to energy. But one note that I found really striking is Kenya, for example, is something of an exception. Turkey has defense ties with Kenya and it's seeking greater infrastructure cooperation. But Turkey's presence in Kenya is nowhere near as extensive as it is in places like Somalia. And my argument, this is a theory that needs to be tested by IR scholars, but this is my theory. My argument is that one reason for this is that compared to much of the region, Kenya is a relatively stable democracy, comparatively speaking. And that really matters because stronger institutions, a vibrant civil society, and greater public scrutiny make it harder for outside powers like Turkey to expand their influence unchecked. So that's why, in many ways, instability is what creates the space for these countries to deepen their reach. One Kenyan scholar told me that in Kenya there is this growing youth movement that increasingly questions these what these foreign actors are doing in Kenya. For example, Emiratis are buying lots of ports and key infrastructure, and the Kenyan youth is not happy about that. For example, in Somalia, which is a lot more autocratic place, you cannot see that public pressure because there is not enough space. So Turkey basically can do whatever it wants. And as you mentioned, Amber, and it's important, this energy deal that Turkey struck with Somalia, it favors Turkey. And it comes at the expense of local communities in Somalia. And if this was a democratic country, there would be pushback, there would be a request for accountability, but there's none of that.
But at the same time, of course, as you mentioned, they have all kinds of internal divisions, the problems with Puntland, with Somaliland, and all of that, of course, makes the place a very unstable one. So ultimately, when Turkey comes in that way, it's not, as you said, contributing at all to stability, quite the opposite. And of course, the kinds of existing divisions can only become deeper, I would imagine, with other malign actors stepping in to further destabilize the place and fracture the place. But ultimately, of course, it all boils down to what kind of model Turkey is bringing. And you look at what Turkey is today, democracy on life support, right? Very, very depressing, actually, in many ways. So, Gonul, thank you so much for joining us here today. And we're very much looking forward to your book on this because I think that's what's in the works, right?
Well, there's a huge line, but hopefully, yes, I find the region fascinating, and I'm hoping to do more
Well,
on
I
this.
can't think of anyone better than yourself to do this, Gonul. You did such a great book on Turkey's adventures in Syria. So, Turkey's adventures, Erdogan's adventures in Africa sounds a bit like a Tintin series, doesn't it?
Thank you so much, Amber, and thanks for having me.
And that's it for today. For more in-depth reporting on the Middle East and North Africa, please go to our website www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.